like to express our gratitude to the Joshi family for their generosity in making this lecture series possible. The lecture today is a very special lecture celebrating the 70th anniversary of India's independence. Now, how to celebrate India? What a challenge. But what better way to celebrate India than to bring to campus a renowned, world-renowned scholar on Gandhi. And so we have. We're honored to have as our speaker today Karuna Mandana, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and also the Chair of South Asia Council at Yale University. Professor Mandana received her Bachelor of Science in International Relations from London School of Economics. And then she received a master's degree in Ideology and Discourse Analysis from Essex University. And then she received her PhD from Harvard University in government. Her research interests include modern political theory, modern social theory, the theory and history of empire, and South Asia history and politics. Her first book, Alibis of Empire, Henry Maine, and the Ends of Liberal Imperialism, analyzed the transformation of 19th-century British imperial thought. Her current work focuses on the political realism and the political thought of Mohandas K. Gandhi. Her widely acclaimed article in the American Political Science Review was entitled, "Another Realism, the Politics of Gandhian Nonviolence." It demonstrated how Gandhi's principle of satyagraha, or nonviolent action, could be viewed as a practical orientation to politics, as opposed to a moral proposition. This principle has inspired many others who have sought social and political change, especially Martin Luther King. And in fact, she's recently taught a course at Yale called Gandhi, King, and the Politics of Nonviolence. But this principle of nonviolence actually has inspired a lot of controversy as well. And so Professor Mandana's talk today addresses the controversy in her talk entitled "The Grammar of Anarchy or the Safeguard of Freedom, Gandhian Satyagraha and Democratic Politics." Please join me in welcoming Professor Mandana to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Betty, for the invitation and for a gracious introduction. It's really an honor to speak to you today. Let me know if you can't hear me in the back or if I'm looking too far down. And of course, a thank you to the Joshi family for supporting the program and for this lecture. And obviously, the honor is partially, I don't know if it's an honor or there's a kind of sadness in thinking about the occasion of the 70th anniversary of Indian independence. I think it's a very important question, I think, to think through what have been the continuities and what have been the disappointments as well as aspirations across those 70 years. What I want to talk about today, I think, hits on some of that, thinking through the legacies of the independence movement and what challenges and new dimensions of politics have emerged with the deepening of democracy in India. So the topic of my talk really is about the relationship between nonviolent protest and democracy, a topic in some ways essential to India's political history across the 20th century and obviously still important today. But it's also, I think, a more urgent topic for democratic theory or democracy more generally in this country and in India, namely what role protests can and should play under conditions of democratic fragility when democracies seem especially contentious, polarized, and threatened in various ways. I begin with one of the more striking speeches about India's future delivered by Bhimrao Ambedkar at the conclusion of the Constituent Assembly in 1949. Ambedkar, as many of you know, was the most important political leader of the Dalits, or leader of the formerly untouchable caste, as well as the chief drafter of the Indian Constitution. In this speech in 1949, Ambedkar voiced a number of anxieties about India's future, about whether India could retain, in his words, its independence and its fledgling democracy. His most poignant warning concerned India's political democracy and whether it could be sustained without significant advances in socioeconomic equality, towards socioeconomic equality. Ambedkar's scholarship and his entire political life tried to demonstrate that the Indian caste system had made Indian society grossly inimical to democratic ideals of individual freedom, equality, and fraternity. And that was what needed to be corrected in some sense by becoming a political democracy. So this is a famous quote of his that you may have already come across. On the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we shall be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. If we continue to deny it for long, we will do so only by putting our political democracy in peril. We must remove this contradiction at the earliest possible moment, or else those who suffer from inequality will blow up the structure of political democracy, which this assembly has so laboriously built up. In this speech, Ambedkar also issued a number of other warnings, and I'm going to focus on another one that's come up occasionally in debate, which is connected to the first worry, but is more focused on the question of protest, what kind of methods people will rely on to address questions of inequality especially, or what might, in his words, blow up the structure of political democracy. So here again we have an anxious warning from Ambedkar. It says, if we wish to maintain democracy in form, in fact, not just in form, the first thing we must do is to hold fast to constitutional methods of achieving our social and economic objectives. We must abandon the bloody methods of revolution. It also means that we must abandon the method of civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and satyagraha. When there is no way left for constitutional methods for achieving economic and social objectives, there was a great deal of justification for unconstitutional methods. But where constitutional methods are open, there can be no justification for these unconstitutional methods. These methods are nothing but the grammar of anarchy, and the sooner they are abandoned, the better for us. Of course, neither of the protest methods that Ambedkar mentioned have really disappeared. Indeed, we might say that both armed rebellion and Gandhian-style protests have not only persisted, but have expanded alongside the growth of Indian democracy. And many critics likewise have worried about the threats posed by extreme protest tactics to India's democratic institutions. The idea that the methods of bloody revolution or armed rebellion is incompatible with democracy is, perhaps for all of us, a more intuitive claim. But what was it about nonviolent protest, about civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and satyagraha that Ambedkar thought was threatening to democracy or incompatible with democracy? The main worry, I think, for Ambedkar's generation was the threat of anarchy, as I said, the grammar of anarchy. That resort to direct action to push one's policy or politics would undermine the respect for law on the one hand and the political process, the outcome of elections. And this would especially be dangerous when these institutions were new, were just being developed, and the habits associated with democratic life needed, in Ambedkar's mind, needed to be cultivated and learned. Ambedkar wasn't alone in this warning. Even some of Gandhi's closest comrades, Vallabhbhai Patel, Jawaharlal Nehru, worried, especially in the 50s and 60s, we'd say, and the 70s, continues, actually every generation, worries that the resort to unconstitutional methods was a dangerous legacy of the independence movement. and when governing started, Satyagraha had to end. I think you see a continuity with a more recent form of the debate about protest tactics, and this has posed the question a little differently, not so much about anarchy, but related to a worry about coercion. So the claim is that certain protest tactics, like these unconstitutional methods or direct action, even ostensibly nonviolent forms of them, can be coercive and therefore undemocratic. So this criticism was especially prominent in a revealing public debate, around Anna Hazare and the political fast he undertook in connection with the Lokpal agitations. This was in 2011 and 12, and it was part of the India Against Corruption campaign, and Hazare himself styled himself as a kind of Gandhian leader. And critics of Anna's fast, I mean, there were a lot of critics about the actual bill and whether it was Gandhian or what, but I'm going to focus really on the tactic. And critics of the fast often cited Ambedkar's warning about the grammar of anarchy, and in particular criticized the tactic of a fast, a hunger strike, or fast unto death, as being deeply anti-democratic. So one famous commentator, Pratap Bhanumehta, for example, argued that fasting unto death, when tied to moral authority, amounts to blackmail. It is coercive moral power, or the tyranny of virtue. While protest is legitimate, coercive moral power violates two norms of democratic society. In democracy, there will always be deep and legitimate disagreement, and differences have to be respected and tolerated. Disagreement can't be solved by coercion. Disagreements have to be solved by the mechanisms of representative democracy. That was his claim. But a whole range. I mean, in a way, Mehta is arguing from he's making the case in a kind of a liberal position about the relationship between, making a division between protest, which he accepts as legitimate, and certain kinds of tactics, which he again takes to be coercive or blackmail. But there were numerous commentators, both many on the left as well, who I'll just give you a couple of citations. Said, a fast unto death amounts to holding a gun to one's head. It's suicide bombing in slow motion, and also that the mass rallies had disturbing echoes of rallies under Hitler or Stalin that are excited about the idea of moral cleansing. So here I think you have both, you have critics from across the ideological spectrum worried about certain kinds of democratic, what we take to be democratic forms of protest. On the flip side, I think you have a general assumption that protest and large-scale assembly, for many of us, seem like the bread and butter of competitive democratic politics. So the more people you can assemble, the more seemingly representative or democratic the cause is or seems to be. In India, not only have many parties and movements used Gandhian-style techniques from the Bund, which was probably, some would say it came out of the older form called the Hartal. It was originally a day of mourning, but in the 20s and 30s, Gandhi had transformed it to a day-long work stoppage. Now we see bunds everywhere. It's a common feature of Indian politics. Hunger strikes, of course, by both party leaders as well as non-party leaders and social movements are a regular feature of Indian politics. Likewise, political parties organize street demonstrations to demonstrate support and power. And it's obvious. In some ways, it's obvious that these are commonplace features of Indian protest, or we would just say Indian politics, and they often involve everyday politics of this kind. Organizing involves breaking the law or causing public inconvenience, and that's the way you get attention. So in a way, everyday Indian politics has this nature, has some sense of unruliness, disruptiveness, and can be intimidating. So I think the question I want to raise in some ways is, what should we think of these protests as a form of democratic activity? Should we be celebrating these as instances of democratic activity, or should we is there a way to be more critical? And if we are critical, on what grounds do we differentiate forms of protest that are democratic from forms of protest that we take to be undermining? So my general position or proposition is that we need to think more critically about the practice of protest. In some sense, I think I would side with those who take it to be an essential feature of democratic politics, so you can't wish it away or ban it or assume that it's undemocratic in nature. But I also think that we have to look and think through what kinds of practices, tendencies towards coercion, and think about which ones are in some ways not always democratic or conducive to strengthening democracy. So in this talk, to raise some questions about that, the issue of protest, I want to look back to Gandhi's understanding of satyagraha. Partially, I think, as the Anna case registered, there's still a lot of, even if I think in many ways Gandhi and politics, or Gandhi as a political figure, have been repudiated in various ways by the left and right in India, there still is a way in which this kind of style of Gandhi in politics still has some appeal, as I've said, the hunger strike, the bun. There are things that are recognizably Gandhian. And so, so I think there's something useful. I think Gandhi, did think long and hard about the nature of protest, but those rules and questions that he asked are not always available in the public register, and so I wanted to bring some of those debates back. And I think in the way I approach this question is, I think what's interesting about Gandhi's understanding of satyagraha is not just that it's not just as a set of moral rules about how to do protests, but also I think is to rekindle his interest in what I would call the politics of protest, or the strategic and tactical purposes of protest. So I think, and Gandhi, I think, as well, was animated by a similar kind of question or anxiety about how to shape political protest to make it both compatible with democratic ideals and also more persuasive in democratic contexts. So in this sense, I think Gandhi was also, in a way, like Ambedkar, like Nehru, acutely aware of the dangers of civil disobedience. So for example, his idea, of course, in Gandhi's idea, the essence of civil disobedience is that everyone has a right and sometimes a duty to disobey laws that you understand to be immoral or degrading. So when you activate this right, when you become a civil resistor, you are essentially, quote, assuming the law unto yourself. And when civil disobedience scales upwards, when a movement contests not just one law, but all laws emanating from what they might take to be an unjust or corrupt regime, then civil disobedience signals, again in Gandhi's words, a total denial of the authority of the state. So this is what makes it such a potent weapon, but as Gandhi came to realize, it's also a power that's, quote, always fraught with danger. It could encourage and signal simple lawlessness or anarchy. For example, in his own disobedience campaigns, many dissolved into riots. And also he was worried that collective or mass civil disobedience was especially fraught with danger. Demonstrations that involved the power of numbers could, in Gandhi's language, function as sheer force, or in a way were by nature coercive. They exacted compliance through intimidation and pressure. So Gandhi's contention, or starting worry, was that contention, I think, was that ostensibly nonviolent protest, when it appears as anarchy or coercion, would lose its political advantages. So the question is, how did Gandhi himself square the circle? How can you both retain, promote a right to disobedience and practice it? How do you do disruptive protest without promoting lawlessness on the one hand, or coercion? And Gandhi's answer was to introduce discipline into the practice of nonviolent protest. And ideally, I think the way to think about nonviolence in Gandhian satyagraha was a form of disciplined disruption or disciplined disobedience. So to get a little bit more into Gandhi's thinking about this, I'm going to spend the middle section of this talk talking about two instances that arose in Gandhi's first mass campaigns in India, where he encountered and directly addressed these questions of anarchy and coercion, and where he had to, in a way, find practical solutions to correct for this tendency towards anarchy or coercion. As many of you know, Gandhi started his political career as an activist in South Africa, and over a period of 21 years there, where he led a series of campaigns against various restrictions on the rights of Indian migrants and indentured laborers, he returned to India 21 years later. So South Africa, again, in Gandhi's career, was an important testing ground for his new method of satyagraha. It was invented there, but it was still performed or articulated on a relatively small scale. And the importance of the first Indian campaigns was the question of scale. So the scale changed very rapidly. So when he returned to India, it was 1915. Very rapidly, 4 short years later, Gandhi would command the first national mobilizations against British rule. First, a satyagraha against the Rowlatt Bills in 1919, and then more spectacularly, with the All India mobilization known as the non-cooperation or Khilafat movement. Gandhi envisioned these campaigns as explicit experiments in mass nonviolent action. In his words, quote, satyagraha was being brought into play on a large scale on the political field for the first time. We often forget, though, how both campaigns ended, rather dramatically and arguably as at least partial failures. They were both called off by Gandhi when they became implicated in incidents of violence. Now, Gandhi, of course, and I don't think historians would see them as total failures. Gandhi thought they taught ordinary people to overcome fear of imperial authority and regain their inherent power to contest oppression through mass action. But I think in some ways they're failures in the sense that they didn't accomplish their purported goals. The Rowlatt Acts weren't repealed initially, and non-cooperation didn't end with Swaraj, or self-rule, in 1 year, as Gandhi's famous slogan went. But here I want to highlight their failures as nonviolent campaigns. So they both led to outbreaks of violence. Gandhi suspended them specifically to reassess why nonviolence, mass nonviolence, led to violence. He famously referred to these series of missteps as his Himalayan miscalculations. So in diagnosing each, Gandhi started to map out and remodel nonviolent action and tried to correct, I think, what he saw as inner tendencies towards violence. Civil disobedience, non-cooperation, these were various branches, or what Gandhi called branches in the tree of satyagraha. Satyagraha was translated by him as nonviolent direct action, sometimes as civil resistance, sometimes as truth force. It literally meant grasping for or insisting upon truth. And Gandhi invented the term as a way to differentiate what he called his own intensely active politics of nonviolence from passive resistance, which to many implied passivity and withdrawal. The first mass satyagraha against the Rowlatt Bills, so the Rowlatt Bills were these wartime detention acts or anti-sedition acts, authorizing, amongst other things, preventative detention without trial. They're very similar, in fact, they were similar to the Patriot Act or to TADA, but actually it's noteworthy that the Rowlatt Acts were much less severe than what we live under today. The Rowlatt Acts were the kind of laws that Gandhi said demanded what he called automatic or defensive disobedience. Defensive disobedience was akin to self-defense. It was a necessary or automatic response to laws that violate fundamental moral and political principles. In South Africa, the Asiatic Acts were examples of degrading laws that he said, quote, no self-respecting Indian could accept. And likewise, he used similar language of self-respect and dignity. And in this case, he said government restrictions on civil liberty were equally degrading. And so in respect to these kinds of laws, everyone had a moral duty to disobey. But within weeks of the campaign, it was suspended. And the reason for the suspension was mostly in Bombay and Ahmedabad, riots had ensued upon rumors of Gandhi's arrest. He wasn't actually arrested, but he was prevented from traveling to Punjab in the middle of the campaign. These riots, or what we euphemistically call riots, were instances where the demonstrations overflowed into attacks on persons and property, and sometimes even more organized acts of sabotage or provocation, so train derailments, attacks on police, government property, and sometimes government personnel or cooperators or collaborators. After these incidents, Gandhi began insisting on the civility of disobedience, so the civil part of the term civil disobedience. When the term civil disobedience is, I think, rightfully originated with Thoreau, but when Thoreau used the term civil disobedience, the civil was was meant as another name for the state. It's a reference to state or government. So civil disobedience meant resistance to civil government, which was the original title of the essay. So in Thoreau, there's no contrast between civil and uncivil. It wouldn't make sense. But this was what Gandhi was doing. So Gandhi introduced this new valence or new meaning to civility. He contrasted civil with uncivil or criminal disobedience. And in that way, I think, changed the resonance or meaning of civil disobedience. So in Gandhi's terms, for the act of civil disobedience to project the right meaning, it had to be performed with civility, with exemplary discipline and organization. This was how the civil disobedient would distinguish their actions from the anarchist, who denied the legitimacy of law as such, and the criminal, who defied the law when it was in their self-interest to do so. So Gandhi started to argue and repeat this argument that only someone who was known as a habitual follower of law or had proven obedience in some way could be an effective disobedient. Now, I think these kinds of rules that Gandhi gave, and he gave many of them, I want to look at them not as moral criteria about what makes a good civil disobedient or makes an act more just or legitimate, but a pragmatic maxim about the message you communicate through protest. So here I think Gandhi was concerned with how you perform civility, how you convey to an opponent or the public at large, or how you shape public debate in such a way that you appear neither as a criminal or an anarchist or a simple disturber of political order. And the way you do that is through the form of protest. I mean, that is a public performance. And so, and I think this is something that carries forward from Gandhi to King in thinking about the semiotics of nonviolent protest. So one of the earliest, and I think really interesting analysts of Gandhi and Satyagraha, Reinhold Niebuhr, talked a lot about the way that nonviolent protest works, and Niebuhr was influential and generally as a social theorist in America, but also influential on Martin Luther King. And what both Niebuhr and King, I think, understood about the semiotics of protest was that in order for nonviolent protest to work, you have to undermine people's expectations or change the dynamics of how people see. And often people who are contesting the status quo are seen as anarchists or disturbers of the public order or criminals of some kind. And in order to get people to see beyond what Niebuhr would call this is all kind of obfuscation, to see more clearly the message of the movement, you have to perform protest in a way to undermine or change people's expectations. So civility or goodwill is performed. In Gandhi, this is discipline. In King, he uses the language of dignity. So protest, nonviolent protest stages discipline and dignity. And the three, and at least I think in three ways civility is performed. One is through comportment. So there's a lot of emphasis on dress and manners and rules about silence and following the rules of protest. Both Gandhi, of course, from the very beginning, emphasized the idea of vows, taking vows, and following them. King also had a vow that you would take during the Birmingham protest, for example. And taking solemn vows was also a way to show that you know how to follow your own rules. So Gandhi would often say the way you distinguish, again, not to distinguish not to yourself, but to an audience who doesn't know you, that you are not an anarchist or a criminal, is that you develop laws that you show that you can follow yourself. So it's a kind of, you're displaying your own freedom, or freedom as self-rule. And also, of course, famously, you accept the burdens of protest. You show yourself willing to risk something serious if you break a law, and you willingly and quietly accept punishment. So that is part of the debate about anarchy. And in non-cooperation, I think, during the non-cooperation campaign, Gandhi starts to confront the flip side of it, which is the problem of coercion. Now, obviously, anarchy and coercion are in some ways related. If anarchy is the worry about undermining the rule of law, and you think of coercive protests as demonstrations of power, obviously politics that's decided by pure coercion is another kind of anarchy. It would be a Hobbesian kind of anarchy. So the second of Gandhi's Himalayan miscalculations was more directed, or more directly concerned with coercion, and it came with the end of the non-cooperation movement ended dramatically with an outbreak of violence at Chauri Chora, a village in eastern UP. So non-cooperation was officially launched on the 1st of August 1920, so about a year and a half after the Rowlatt Satyagraha, and it combined these grievances, partially about Rowlatt, but also the Amritsar massacre, which took place a week after the Rowlatt Satyagraha had started, and more generally a concurrent campaign for the protection of Khilafat. So the strategy of mass non-cooperation on an all-India scale, again, it lasted from 1920 to the beginning of 1922, and it was really about a year and a half of serious momentum, and it was also the occasion where you had the revivification, it's too many vivics, of the Congress Party, and the Congress Party became, in a way, a true mass political party under the banner of non-cooperation. Non-cooperation as a strategy was slightly different from civil disobedience, as I tried to explain before. So in its initial phase, it entailed the surrender of honorary titles and offices, the boycott of government schools, courts, councils, and functions, the resignation of lawyers and civil servants, the boycott of foreign cloth, and the advocacy of Swadeshi. And the conclusive steps were more provocative. They included resignation from the police and army, and finally the non-payment of taxes. So the latter stages of non-cooperation would move from campaigns or from acts of withdrawal or non-participation, actions that did not in themselves break any laws, to what Gandhi called aggressive mass civil disobedience. And non-cooperation is different from civil disobedience in the sense that, again, its purpose was a kind of step-by-step withdrawal of consent on a mass scale. And this was linked to Gandhi's idea of a kind of consent theory of power. So he argued, quote, in politics, the use of satyagraha was premised upon the immutable maxim, the government of the people is possible only so long as they consent either consciously or unconsciously to be governed. So in reneging on pledges, which was the claim about Khilafat, or passing harsh laws over widespread popular objection, which is the claim about Rowlatt, and humiliating or abusing its subjects in Punjab and the massacre, the British had thoroughly undermined their claims to rule in the interests of their Indian subjects. The purpose of non-cooperation was to make this visible, this loss of legitimacy visible, by attacking its material basis, namely the cooperation or collaboration of its subjects. It was, quote, the inherent right of a subject to refuse to assist a government that will not listen, for no government, much less the Indian government, can subsist when its people cease to serve it, unquote. Withdrawing affiliation and assistance would bring the government to a standstill, and successful non-cooperation would be the practical demonstration of the idea that the true basis of a government's power is the people over whom it governs. So with the success, so the movement was again successful in this first year especially, and near the end of in the middle of 1921, there were calls from a number of different quarters to escalate the campaign and to begin the second part of non-cooperation, which would be mass civil disobedience in the form of non-payment of revenue tax. And Gandhi, again, thought of a no-tax campaign as a radical step, one that implied full and open defiance of all government laws and authority. In Gandhi's terms, it was aggressive disobedience. And the difference, he would say, between defensive or aggressive is, the refusal to pay taxes was not contesting the legitimacy of taxation, but the legitimacy of the regime itself. So it's a defensive civil disobedience in Gandhi's language is when you contest an immoral law or a degrading law or a law you take to be degrading. But this is sort of scaling up to contesting the legitimacy of the regime itself. So non-payment of taxes, so we're not against the payment of taxes, we're against the regime and its authority to tax. And also he thought of mass disobedience of land taxes would also bring a vulnerable class into direct conflict with the police and army, in this case the peasants. Repression was almost certain, and people would have to be willing and able to remain steadfast amidst severe provocation. So this again was a kind of sacrifice or discipline that Gandhi thought had to be built over time and conveyed. And so he, hence two aspects of the non-cooperation program, he insisted on the deliberate pacing. You had these progressive steps of the NCO, the non-cooperation platform, and also he wanted to do this as an exempt. He chose one district, the Bardoli district, where he was going to do this no tax campaign as a kind of exemplary site. He finally, again, he postponed it many times, again, because he thought it was a pretty radical step and people needed to be ready, as he used the language of, you had to be disciplined and ready to make that sacrifice. Finally, he announced it in February 1922, but in the very week that the no tax campaign was to begin, these violent incidents at Chauri Chaura brought the movement to, again, a dramatic and this time much more controversial end. In Chauri Chaura, the local police had opened fire on a non-cooperation demonstration organized by Congress volunteers. The protesters, in numbers, had the upper hand. They forced the constables to retreat into the police station. The station was then set alight, leaving 23 policemen dead. Gandhi and the Congress Working Committee announced the immediate cessation of mass civil disobedience, and Gandhi began famously a 5-day fast of atonement and purification. Gandhi was arrested 6 weeks later, which effectively ended non-cooperation. So the decision to suspend non-cooperation in the aftermath of violence at Chauri Chaura was one of the most controversial of Gandhi's career. Many, again, of his younger supporters, people like Nehru and others, couldn't understand how Gandhi could call off the movement at the height of its suspension. But I'm going to just talk about what Gandhi's reasoning was for calling it off, and to note that what most concerned Gandhi was not violence per se, but the coercive character of the protest. And so just to link back up to the problem of, to think about coercion in protest. So at Chauri Chaura, Gandhi, what he saw was, he said, his analysis or diagnosis of the situation was that Congress workers showed that, quote, they liked and loved excitement. And underneath these vast demonstrations was an idea unconsciously lurking in the breast that it was a kind of demonstration of force, the very negation of violence. In his interpretation, the outbreak of the violence was a consequence of a procession that was purposefully taken in the direction of the police station, knowing full well that it would instigate a collision between the police and the people. And in that sense, violence followed from this structure of protest, led and supported by Congress volunteers, that was meant to demonstrate power and to provoke a response. So here Gandhi linked the excitement of action, we call it excitement, to the experience of collective power and the strength of acting in numbers. This was akin to what Gandhi called the subtle violence implicit in the idea of the majority, where the power of numbers, rather than truth or discipline or suffering, seemingly does the work of compliance. So the problem of coercion was twofold. On the one hand, Gandhi argued that for satyagraha to work, it had to appear free of coercion to be politically effective. So his argument was that when protest looks like coercion or violence, it breeds resentment, recalcitrance, and resistance. It is not ultimately persuasive. And secondly, Gandhi feared that that Indians, as they were becoming freed, overcoming their own sense of fear or self-enslavement was the language Gandhi used, and they were becoming conscious of their own strength, the danger was that they would, quote, repeat the mistakes of the rulers in an exaggerated form in our relations with those who happen to be weaker. So here Gandhi worried that in the name of democracy, the rule of the majority would become coercive against those who are weaker. And the danger was, again, of awakening a kind of political freedom that, in overcoming slavery, also reveled in mastery. And I think a worry that democracy has these two elements, one, an egalitarian element, a moral promise, but it also has this sense of power through numbers that can be dangerous. So again, the question that I am interested in is how did he think you could correct this as a form of protest? So one of his answers, again, is a return to questions of discipline. Discipline for Gandhi, the word that he would use sacrifice as well. The Sanskrit word is tapas or tapasya, which can mean something like ascetic self-mastery or acts of discipline. He translates it often as suffering or self-suffering. He also translates tapas as power. So one aspect is, again, like the question of civility, it's about discipline and organization and comportment and following what he called the rules of nonviolent action. Discipline, suffering, sacrifice, and their dramatization was to be what, these are the central features, or what is nonviolent protest is supposed to dramatize these aspects of the character or the comportment of the protesters. And the second thing, I think, this is in connection especially to the worry about collective power, is Gandhi also, I think, tried to reassert individuation in the midst of mass protest. So on the rules of nonviolence, again, allegiance, so there was insistence on rules, and the rules, allegiance to rules, show that activists are willing to bear the costs and burdens of protest, the cost of self-organization, as well as willingness to sacrifice. And Gandhi's collected works, which are 100 volumes, a lot of his writings, his daily writings and his journals were devising and discussing numerous rules for specific actions, like pickets, boycotts, hartals, when he thought you, and the hunger strike, for example, and when you could consider it a truly nonviolent protest. And in that language, it was when they would avoid all appearance of coercion and intimidation against. Again, I want to think of these as not as moral rules entirely about the intention of the actor, but how they are performed, or what it's, again, as he would say, they're supposed to avoid all appearance of coercion and intimidation, how the public and opponents perceive it. So just a couple of rules, just as some examples. So for example, on pickets, he would say, and pickets were very common in this period around, prohibition or picketing of both cloth shops, foreign cloth, and also temperance campaigns, so picketing liquor shops. And his argument was that, a nonviolent picket is when it crosses the line to coercion if you physically try to stop picket crossers. And he often would add, so coercion was often when you started to do things that were physically constraining someone else's activity. And so their compliance or their reaction to your protest, if you were compromising their voluntary nature, he thought that was inappropriate, illegitimate in some ways, but also I think he thought it was strategically a bad choice. It wasn't going to be persuasive. The other example were boycotts. So one, of course, famously argued that the cloth boycott had to be not specifically targeted at British cloth, it had to be a boycott of a foreign cloth in general. So it shouldn't be a punishment about British cloth, but it should be an idea of self-reliance more generally, so it should be a principle, not a punishment. And also, and this sort of gets back to the question of differences, on issues where there's more genuine disagreement, those are issues when you really can't coerce, or you can't include compulsion. So one of the main aspects of non-cooperation was the boycott of schools or educational institutions led famously by students boycotting. And some excited students would also lie down in front of their universities to stop people from attending schools. And Gandhi said this was, in this case especially, that people might, are advocating the withdrawal of schools. It was an important feature of all of his arguments against institutions he thought breeded complicity with the government, and schools and courts were the main ones. But he also said that there was a genuine disagreement about the purpose of Western education, and so you couldn't physically stop students. People had to voluntarily choose to choose to boycott. And relatedly, when on the Harto, the one-day or few-day work stoppage, he always argued that Hartals had to be announced in advance, weeks in advance, and you had to refrain from pursuing compliance on the day itself. This is very different from how bunds usually work in contemporary India. So in the case of the Hartal, he would say a true satyagrahi would protect the shops that choose not to comply. Moreover, a total Hartal with 100% compliance implied coercion. So Gandhi repeatedly said the best demonstration of both the voluntary character of the Hartal and a matter of pride from a satyagraha standpoint would be if some shops stayed open. Often you would say around like 10% of the shops stayed open because it demonstrates voluntarism. Secondly, another aspect which I'll just mention for the sake of time, that Gandhi tried to reinsert individuation or individualization within the dynamics of mass action. And here, I think, again, you can see, again, it was a way to try to think about satyagraha, how to make it mitigate the fact that when you bring large numbers of people out to disrupt and make inconvenient various aspects of daily life, how do you make that that strength or that show of numbers not feel like coercion or intimidation, which it necessarily has an element of. So here Gandhi would say there should be a way in which you, again, through comportment, constraint, try to give an individuating structure to a mass activity. And here I think Gandhi and King both emphasized slowness, silence, repetition, and I think in all of their demonstrations, they focused on these, I think, more directed actions like the sit-in, the march, the freedom ride, rather than flash mobs or something like just trying to get large crowds. Today, I think we often picture nonviolence as sometimes unruly crowds gathering in public spaces. And here, I think, today we think of, I think I'll come back to that point. The other, I think, is the image of khadi itself. Khadi was hand-spun cloth that Gandhi famously recommended or propagated throughout his entire career. And he wanted the khadi system to be this large-scale, decentralized system of cooperative cloth production. But as a mode of collective behavior, what I think is interesting is that khadi is decentralized and it relies on the work of radically isolated individuals. So each individual in the act of spinning is separately cultivating inward discipline and, in Gandhi's language, experiencing a kind of self-will. So it tends to try to turn people more inward to themselves rather than outward as a kind of energy that cannot be controlled. Okay, so I'm going to come to my conclusion. So I think the point for discussion I want to think about is nonviolent direct action is always, in some sense, extra-constitutional. For some, as we saw, I think, for some, this is reason enough to reject it. So in certain moments of crisis, Nehru, Ambedkar, others claim that when institutional channels exist for showing dissent, then disruption outside of those channels is unnecessary and can be dangerous. I think in some ways, this is also the unconscious attitude, we might say, of liberal publics. This is what Niebuhr and King thought. Niebuhr especially thought this is why he thought, liberal democracies instinctively can be hostile to nonviolent protest because they assume that there are regular channels. So why should people take this extreme action? Or the burdens for protest are higher. But as I suggested, I think in some ways this is a little bit displaced. I mean, protest is not going to disappear, partially I think because the idea of large assemblies and demonstrations, there is something about that large-scale assembly that feels like an expression of democratic power. There's an appeal to it, so there's no way that democracies can get rid of some sense that there is something democratic about that way, that ability to generate large numbers. And also, as we know, it's hard to imagine any democracy in India and the US that there are maybe numerous people who feel themselves to be outside the system or lacking in some sort of institutional channels, or that the party system in some ways is corrupt and full of inequality and therefore isn't fully legitimate, and so you need extra constitutional channels. But I think the challenge for us is to open a debate on the kinds of or forms of protest and modes of critique that might be more suited to the challenges and opportunities of democratic politics. And here I'll just end with a couple of thoughts on, even though on the history of nonviolence in relation to democratic politics. So one of the things, so Gandhi's experiments, the ones that I've talked about, that was approximately 100 years ago. And since then, I think there has been a remarkable persistence or resurgence of the theory and practice of nonviolence on the global scale. But even as it has retained its prominence. Most of the time, it is contemporary defenders of nonviolence and practitioners tend to celebrate nonviolence in the form as a form of collective power. And I think the irony of some of the recent celebration of nonviolence is that they tend to disavow or are uninterested in these questions of discipline and individuation. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We can discuss that, I think. But this collective power model, as I said, it's often tethered itself to a theory of democratic power and legitimacy. And as I said, it sort of gets mirrored in the way we think of images of massive crowds occupying public spaces. And the idea is not just that you're displaying strength, but you're also symbolizing popular mobilization or the expression of popular will. But I also think this image is, and actually one more point, is the new social science research has also reinforced, I think, the claim that this kind of collective nonviolence has been surprisingly effective, especially in overturning authoritarian regimes. So Chenoweth and Stephan's really important work on why civil resistance works charts 300 campaigns across the 20th century and notes both the growing frequency of nonviolent movements and their increasing success as compared to armed struggles. I think the numbers they come out with is nonviolent movements are twice as likely to succeed as armed movements. But as I said, the paradigmatic case that they have in mind is anti-authoritarian struggle, or regime change. And this, again, is really important work because a lot of people in the 20th century assumed that nonviolence would only be viable in and against liberal regimes. But again, their work seems to prove exactly the opposite. But what it leaves us with is a very unclear question of nonviolence and its place and role in democratic contexts. And in fact, that there might be reasons why nonviolent politics or protests faces different and maybe even more acute hurdles in democracies. As I said, some of it is because if people believe institutional channels are legitimate, then they place a higher burden on political protest or dissent. And also democratic politics. And then another question is, what does it mean to be successful? Or how does a protest become successful in democratic politics? I think here we also have a problem of thinking about competition. Democratic politics is about passion, power, and competition. This kind of competition or contestation for power often fuels resentments, antagonism, polarization. And Gandhi and King, I think, were adamant because of this that disruptive protests, which would never entirely eschew coercion, but it had to try to mitigate as best it could these negative effects. And it would do so, again, by discipline, but also by being oriented towards persuasion and reconciliation. Because in a democracy, your political antagonists are your own fellow citizens with whom you have to find a means of coexisting in peace, equality, dignity. And in this sense, I think the burdens for protests in democratic politics are heightened or different. It requires the adoption of strategies of critique, programs of change, and tactical action that go beyond mere condemnation or confrontation or disruption, precisely because you have to find these more reciprocal ways of living together. So again, I think this is what I think both King and Gandhi recognize, that nonviolence is both more necessary and more demanding in these contexts. And I think here, so this is what I would say is maybe one lesson, or at least to start opening up to think again about what is distinctive about democratic politics or democratic context, and especially what makes persuasion or something like that through protest both necessary and difficult. So I'll end up.
So,
Yeah, sure.
thank you so much, and Professor Mantenna, for really introducing us to some of the complexities of this extremely important concept. And I'm thinking there's so much violent protest in the world today, and so much anger, that I can't think of another time when this would be a more important concept to try to understand and to try to see what the alternatives are. So I would let her field your questions. So if you could just sure you must have some questions.
Thank you for giving that lecture. It did definitely open up.
You have to talk about it.
It did definitely open up my mind to more ideas of protest and how it needs to be so civilized and certainly was disciplined. And I was wondering if you believe that that form of Gandhian civilization protest is something that has kept India so much more stable than, let's say, some of its neighbors with their military dictatorships, civil wars, and other things. Do you believe that has contributed to?
That's a very good question. Did everyone hear the question?
Maybe you should repeat it.
Yeah. The question was whether the tradition of civil, this sort of idea of a civil protest or nonviolent protest is one of the reasons that contributes to India's stability, democratic stability versus some of its neighbors. It's a very good question. I mean, I tend to think that actually the movement, the movement itself, with Gandhi, I think, in ways, Gandhi was always trying to keep the movement nonviolent, but almost every campaign, except for maybe the Salt Satyagraha, famously was probably the kind of iconic, perfectly choreographed movement in some ways that's why we remember it as an iconic movement. But I think Gandhi always thought that the Indian movement was, if not openly violent, it was, I think he thought the danger was that it was a demonstration of collective or majoritarian power. So one of the things when there's this famous quote, line that's often quoted where he's interviewing Howard Thurman, an African-American theologian, comes and visits Gandhi on a trip through South Asia in the 30s, and it's in their meeting that Gandhi says, it's through the Negroes of America that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be given to the world. It's a famous quote. And here I think it's interesting what Gandhi means by that is partially that in India he thinks the movement is adulterated, meaning it's not pure because it's never unclear if what's really just working is majoritarian power and collective power. And if you were really going to demonstrate something like the pure demonstration, as he calls it, the pure demonstration of nonviolence, it would be in a context of minority politics. So South Africa he takes it to be, and he takes. So that's why if the Negroes of America could demonstrate the power of nonviolence, it would be a true lesson. So I'm not sure that Gandhi himself thought that that the practice of nonviolent protest was pure enough to have these good implications, but I think maybe the better argument and the reason why India, at least in the transition, was luckier than some of its neighbors was partially that because the independence movement lasted 20, 30 years, there was an enormous, many leaders had to coordinate and serve various governing functions. The Congress was this gigantic, large-scale movement, and I think one of the things you do see is a huge difference between India and Pakistan is those leaders, many of them continued to rule or were in power, not just one person like Nehru, but Patel, Rajaji, others. There was a wider level of leaders that could continue to contest each other and show some sort of conciliation over the long term. Jinnah famously died very early on, and so I think some of it is contingent in some ways about the kind of leadership and practices of compromise and conciliation that persisted. But I do think that one of the things that we're seeing, and I think Gandhi was more perceptive about, one of the reasons Gandhi was so worried about the Hindu-Muslim question was, I think, linked to this worry about majoritarian power. I think he was much more acutely receptive to why this is going to become worse after independence. Because once you give majorities real power, then he thought both the Hindu-Muslim question and the caste question were going to be more difficult to solve once again Hindu majorities were in power.
So thank you for now. I would have waited until the other questions have been taken, but because some colleagues have to leave, It's interesting that you used that speech by Ambedkar as a point of departure. One would say that the way the speech, and I was actually rereading it as you were talking, one would say that the way the speech was, it was actually probably more an argument about the absence of equality and fraternity in India, and that he was using as a lens to look at satyagraha for who's on whose behalf, the questions of representation, all of that. And interestingly, you mentioned at the end that in a democracy you're protesting against and you're arguing against your fellow citizens. That precisely was the argument that Ambedkar was making, right? So in that sense, Gandhi's satyagraha was actually authoritarian. It was not democratic in any real sense of the word, because he's against the numbers. He wants to keep all of his decision-making powers in his own sense. And so, I don't know what we can learn from this kind of juxtaposition of Ambedkar's argument to Gandhi's argument. And this is separate from your core argument, which I see.
I mean, I didn't actually mean to make it a huge contrast. It's just that a lot of people have cited that Ambedkar speech, especially in relation to the Anna Hazare in criticizing tactics of fast. And I think when they cite the Ambedkar speech, I think they, I don't think Ambedkar, as you said, Ambedkar has, he mentions a lot of things he's worried about very briefly at the end of this famous speech. And people use that term, and I think in some ways, I think Ambedkar and Gandhi would both agree that in some ways even, I actually think Ambedkar is as worried about coercion and not actually anarchy. And so I was partially trying to bring out what people mean when they're saying they're worried about anarchy. I mean, there is a worry about anarchy. I think Ambedkar, because of the Constituent Assembly and the making of the Constitution, is worried about how you get people to follow laws. How do you build in norms of reciprocity? And I think for Ambedkar, that's also linked to democratic ideas of fraternity and reciprocal recognition. So I think these are connected for him. And I think he does think that unconstitutional methods will disrupt this building of some sort of reciprocity. I mean, Ambedkar is probably the Dalit movement in some ways is the most nonviolent movement, in all India, compared to any other movement. And part of the reason is because Ambedkar's deep commitment to constitutional methods and really radical critique of especially Bolshevik or revolutionary methods. So I don't mean to put Gandhi and Ambedkar opposed. I mean, obviously there is a deep debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar on Gandhi's use of the fast and I think not just use of the fast, but I think Ambedkar has a critique of Gandhi being inconsistent and maybe authoritarian and subjective in the rules that I'm describing as Gandhian rules. So I take that critique. I think there are many times where Gandhi doesn't follow his own rules, but I think that Satyagraha and nonviolent resistance has a coherence beyond Gandhi, and so I do think it's hard in India to have a debate about nonviolence that isn't overdetermined by Gandhian ideology or what we take to be his social positions. But I think the fact of how nonviolence has been used, taken up, adapted, and adopted beyond Gandhi, especially in places outside of India, I think means that there's something that Indian political debate can learn from this global expansion. Because I think in India there is no serious debate on nonviolence as a form of protest, because it's too overdetermined by what your position on Gandhi is for the right, the left, and the Ambedkarite movement. But I think, I do think that we should try to open up a debate about both the opportunities and disadvantages of nonviolent protest for democracies. And I think Gandhi is still going to be an important reference because he did think and wrote about the rules and whether, and I know for some it'll be very hard to get over Gandhi's own use of them, but I think even if he didn't follow his rules, I think there are some of those rules they're coherent and they do have democratic implications. But yes, I think this is, you were saying it the nice way, this is a very important, it's a very contentious issue about whether you can separate Gandhi's commitment to nonviolence from his other commitments that you either like or don't like.
Yes, it's not quite well formulated, my question, but I'll give it a shot. So in comparing Gandhi and Martin Luther King, one was a democratic context, the other was not.
Yeah.
And so how do you, take those and his practical sense? So Gandhi had more of a reason to come up with the discipline and be concerned about coercion and anarchy, given that it was a context in which any of those things could lead to mass violence.
Right.
While with Martin Luther King, because it's ostensibly a democracy, right, he had to sort of be more careful, and therefore you see, the disciplining of, behavior, comportment, what you wore is really important. But to me, the coercion element doesn't quite make sense, because democracy is also coercive in that, whole minorities of people don't have a sense. So then in that context, to talk about coercion and civility or non-civility, to me, it's, there's some contradiction and some work that needs to be done there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think, what you see in King's early writings, he does, so I think you're right, Gandhi is much more worried from very early on about coercion, because I think in one sense I think Chaurya is the moment where he recognizes this anxiety about majoritarian power. So he's very concerned from there about numbers. And actually you see in King's early writings some worry, but of course King realizes it disappears because it is a minority movement. So numbers aren't the problem. And so he's not exactly worried about coercion. What he is worried about, though, and I think this is why some overlap in method. So I think the question is, in some ways, even though they have that difference, they both, I think, equally emphasize discipline. I think King and rules and forms and following these forms. And King, I think, uses the term dignity to mean what Gandhi, when Gandhi uses discipline much more often. He says how you do dignified protest, how you stage dignity in protest. But I think what King equally is concerned of, and I think this is a democratic. So King late, as in the late 60s, especially when he has to contest with Black Power and the critique of Black Power, he becomes even more, I think, both aware and emphasizes the distinction between the democratic context to the anti-colonial context. So, of course, he's arguing with people who want to make a direct comparison of Black liberation to anti-colonialism. And King says, but the difference is that in the Gandhian movement, you didn't have, even though Gandhi himself talked about reconciliation with the British, in fact, in practice, you didn't have to reconcile. So you could have a successful movement through pure collective power. And the alien state was going to disappear. And King's last book really makes this strong argument that, again, the problem and it's a real it's the real hard moral fact of minority politics or African American politics, is that your oppressor is your fellow citizen, and so you can't have a fantasy of elimination. And fantasies of guerrilla struggle is just going to eliminate minorities. So I think that's when he thinks you have to come up with an orientation towards reconciliation, or what he calls liberatory integration. So the language is, how do you then get a democratic public that to be self-critical? And how do you get a white majority to see itself implicated in practices of domination? And his argument there is that you have to use nonviolent persuasive techniques, and you can't just. I think here you get into the question of what does it mean to try to persuade a reluctant majority. And so I think again you have it's not a worry about internal coercion, but it is the sense that if you do provocation will lead to alienation. So you have to find modes of protest as well as modes of argument where you can open up a space for some sort of reconciliation. I think here would be, the example I would give is of course something like his idea of the "I have a dream" speech, or he often talked about the white liberal in a lot of his speeches. And part of part of what he was doing there was he didn't assume that there was reconciliation or easy understanding, but he did think in conditions of deep polarization and potential for violence, you had to both point out this figure, the white liberal, as a figure for aspiration and identification, and a figure that you could try to measure yourself up to in some form. He was trying to give people from outside a way in. So I think all of those things are strategies of critique and modes of argument that are trying to move beyond disruption and confrontation. So I think that is similar. But I also think that, just a last note, is I think this is where, controversially, I think that the commonality would be Gandhi on caste is closer, though this will be a huge opening of a huge. That is where Gandhi is talking more about something like the difficult conditions or the relationship between disruption and persuasion, and the challenges for social change, which are quite different from an anti.
Yeah, so if you go back to your...
I think our time is up
Sorry.
for our official session. However, Professor Mandana would be very happy to speak to you. I urge you all to come in and to meet her and to chat with her afterwards. And there should be some refreshments outside. I'll just check and see. Thank you.